That was a section from my piece for soprano, male chorus and orchestra, Songs of Athena. It comprises Athena's four main scenes from my opera Iphigenia in Weimar, in which Athena guides Orestes to an understanding of his duties to his sister, Iphigenia, and to the world. I've come at last to the 50th and final episode in my inquiry, and before I head off, I've decided to pay a visit to Shakespeare in the Ulm Park in Weimar. He who has been of great inspiration to many, including myself, and including those of the Weimar classical era, admired by Herder in particular, and invoking in Goethe a new awakening to the possibilities for literature. I'll just get my bike, it's this way. Every subject's duty is a king's, but every subject's soul is his own. Therefore should every soldier in the wars do as every sick man in his bed, wash every mote out of his conscience, and, dying so, death is to him advantage, or not dying, the time was blessedly lost wherein such preparation was gained. Are there Britons here? They travel about so much, looking for battlefields and ruined walls, the dullest classical places, waterfalls. Here's a sight that's worth all their fuss. They spoke of me too, in their mysteries, and portrayed me as their old iniquity. Looking back over the centuries, it's clear that Saxe-Weimar has played a crucial role in the overall development of European literature and philosophy. It's acted as the spiritual heart of Germany and also inspired many others elsewhere. In particular, my inquiry has shown how the idealists and early romanticists that gathered here during the Goethe era were a critical part of the metaphysical and epistemological tradition that has existed since the time of ancient civilizations and is even more important to the present. Looking at this tradition as it exists today, I haven't even begun to look at how these matters pertain to the global context, such as environmental degradation or political despotism, but I have characterised the current status of metaphysical debate as comprising of two main theories. One, physicalism or materialism, I've used these terms interchangeably, and the other, Russellian monism, which I've described as a direct descendant of idealism. The former is a prevalent orthodoxy, but I have shown the incoherency that characterises its premises and provided a justification for the latter. To wrap things up as best I can, in this final episode I want to do two things. Firstly, to apply these conclusions to my opera so as to justify my compositional efforts, and secondly, to take these ideas one step further, if not to look at matters underpinning globalization, then at least as regards ethics in an abstract sense, to use possible world semantics to look at Deontic Modality, and if possible, to apply this to the International School in Weimar. In exploring the background ideas pertaining to my opera, my inquiry has suggested that, despite the wishful thinking of compatibilists, and with the proviso for what further research into quantum mechanics might reveal, the closed causal systems of materialism imply a deterministic universe. I use the term deterministic in a broad sense. Nevertheless, I include the notion that all states and events, all entities, exist by necessity, and that, as outlined by eliminativism, the notions of free will and human agency are illusion. This too is a metaphysical stance, and in this case it seems it may never be possible to prove, yet, as recognised by those occupied by the Reformation, celebrating its 500 years anniversary, and by Augustine more than a millennium before, it seems the best fit implication. In contrast, a universe that has consciousness itself, or some form of proto-consciousness included as an intrinsic fundamental, either along the lines of the panpsychism model with consciousness alone as fundamental, or the Russellian model with materialism and consciousness sharing a neutral intrinsicality, seems more likely to support free will. Accordingly, panpsychism and Russellian monism are, in the present context, an assertion of human agency. Similarly, the Iphigenia myth and the music and libretto of my opera are an assertion of the same. Her passage to death, and alongside it all the associated orchestral music, is said to be determined by the will of the gods. just as the necessity of mortality is determined by the laws of nature for all of humanity. Yet she and we are able to counter this, not in terms of preventing her death, her slaughter on the altar, but in metaphysical terms. She can conceive her agency, she can feel it, touch its tangibility. It's real, and consequently the determinism upheld by the priests, the obligation placed upon them, is related to the merely contingent. She chooses to accede to the sacrifice as an assertion of her agency and of her very existence as a credible entity. Love and loss, hope and fear, the beauty and the ugly of all ethics and ascetics are, accordingly, all endowed with efficacy. In the second act, she sings, "It is a dream now, yet do not fear my bearing. I came to conviction even when all about was shedding woeful tears, and I persevere with conviction to this day. I give strength to others. I bid them have courage. I bid them lift their eyes to a resplendent path." Given that a consideration of modality and the use of possible world semantics has been such a powerful tool for analysing matters pertaining to metaphysics, in particular that of mind vis-à-vis nature, it seems reasonable to try to use the same tool for matters of ethics, or at least for normative behaviour. In school, given the importance to us of values such as open-mindedness, courageousness and caring for others, teachers are always trying to act as a guide for normative behaviour, modelling to children how to act towards others, how students ought to behave. We ask, what is our duty to others in the class and school and in the world? Deontology is the study of matters pertaining to obligation, duty and accountability. It also embraces the notions of constraint and liability and debt. It asks, to what extent is a person morally obligated to serve the interests of another? In the seminal work of Immanuel Kant, which I looked at in episode 5, it was not treated in a contingent or pragmatic best fit manner. Deontic duty assumed a necessary condition, which he called the categorical imperative. It meant that a person was necessarily obliged to carry out their duties, whatever the consequences. However, it led to paradoxes, whereby a person was morally obligated, for instance, to tell the truth, even if that truth might cause tragedy and hardship. Since then, the issue of whether ethics can ever be considered objective has been debated by many. As I've shown, Habermas's critical theory has striven to locate a consensus on universal justice by way of a discourse-based methodology. However, others have argued that all moral stances are politically motivated and underpinned by opportunities for personal advancement, or alternatively, according to a microbiological perspective, the advancement of the gene. In this context, the question remains, can ethics and the spirit of magnanimity ever rise above the demands of the world and reflect a genuine altruism? Can a virtuous approach ever represent more than naive escapism? Can personal sacrifice ever be genuine? G.E. Moore warned against associating goodness with empirical or any other notions. He argued that reducing the good to natural conditions was doomed to fail. He said that good, by definition, didn't mean anything natural, and nothing natural could be considered good. Gloucester, 'tis true that we are in great danger. The greater therefore should our courage be. Good morrow, brother Bedford. God Almighty, there is some soul of goodness in things evil, would men observingly distill it out. However, modern game theory supports both of these functional possibilities, whereby all thoughts and actions support natural selection, and deontic norms are a mechanism in support of this. The natural goodness of Philippa Foot fits into this category too. She warns against a definition of moral norms based exclusively on rational definitions of necessary fact. Instead, she characterises natural goodness as an autonomous form of morality intrinsic to life itself. The moral path is simply the one that supports a requirement for self-maintenance and development in the self, the family and others. Nevertheless, I've tried a hermeneutic methodology for describing ethics. I should try an analytic one too. I want to look at matters of deontology by way of possible world semantics. Instead of defining necessity and possibility in terms of existent entities, in terms of what there is, I'll need to define them in terms of an obligation to act in a certain way, what our duty is. My diagram proposes a first attempt at how this might work, using the same expression I used in the previous episode. It characterises necessity as a legal requirement. Leaving aside matters of civil disobedience and circumstances whereby justice represents injustice, the law requires a compliance with certain behaviours whatever the circumstances. For instance, I must always drive my car according to the speed limit, necessarily P. The second line with the diamond is more complex. It characterises possibility as a social responsibility, whereby there are many possible worlds in which these responsibilities might be different according to the relative context. Possibly, there is a social responsibility to act in a non-confrontational way towards others. Extending this interpretation of possible world semantics further, I might make the following biconditional proposition: P is a better alternative than not P, if and only if Q. Here's another example. P, children ought to loan their eraser to a friend, if and only if Q, their friend doesn't already have one. Thereafter, I might say there is one possible world, W1, whereby the child ought to do P because of a particular context, Q1, and another possible world, W2, whereby the child ought to do P because of another context, Q2, perhaps because the eraser is newer and more effective, and so forth. In this case, P is a necessity when the child, or an agent, ought to do it in all circumstances, such as is the case for legal compliance. But here's another example. There's one possible world where a person ought to do P, and another possible world where a person ought to do not P. In this case, necessity is defined as P or not P, which is something akin to a tautology, and not very helpful. In this case, possible world semantics seems to have reached a dead end. The problem lies in the fact that deontics is dealing with normative issues. In terms of metaphysics, P is true can be taken to be a bivalent proposition. P is true is either true or false, which is then subject to straightforward analysis. In contrast, in terms of social responsibilities, ought to P is true is a normative expression. Deontic values are non-propositional. They don't have truth value. If I say a subject ought to act in a non-confrontational way towards others, my interpretation of confrontational, or of towards others, or even a subject, may be different to that of others' interpretation. Referring to deontic modals that encode a normative view, Charlo said, "Whenever we try to say something substantive about the content of sentences of such type, we'll be stymied by the diversity of normative views compatible with competent acceptance of such sentences." Indeed, the scope of human agency for random acts should never be underestimated. Even young children are familiar with opposite day syndrome, randomly choosing to do the opposite of what is perceived as the norm or is expected, just for the sake of it, just as a game. The loan of erasers is subject to a complex web of deontics and other factors too. Charlo added, "For just about any rational preference axiom you can state, it's possible to imagine an agent whose preferences cannot be represented with a preference relation satisfying that axiom. Even if I was to outline a behaviour theory or a decision theory which better analyses choices, still the question of which choice should or could or must not be made in any given situation cannot be analysed by possible world semantics. I can say in hindsight that in possible world 1 the subject did option 1, and in possible world 2 the subject did option 2, because these refer to discrete entities. However, deontic entities are subject to additional psychological factors that involve scaling mechanisms rather than the identification of rigid designation. If I say Q1, Q2, and so forth to Qn, then P, the entailment is a deontic one, not a logical one. The implication of this is that in any if-then conditional statement, the then requires a ranking of the strength, the normative significance of the entailment. For instance, should is more demanding than ought, and must is more demanding again. These issues are closely linked to matters of epistemic rationality. They introduce questions of uncertainty. how sure is the subject about the entailment? And indeterminacy, can the subject even tell the best choice? Furthermore, people are sometimes risk adverse, and sometimes they're more responsive to matters of personal identity than rational choices. Sometimes, like children, as Wittgenstein argued, people like to play games. It seems that the goal of using an analytic methodology intended for metaphysics to guide a study of ethics, whether deontological or consequentialist or even virtue-based, is as elusive now as it was in the era of classical Weimar, and as it was in the era of ancient Greece. And I have to ask, what has happened to my Weimar social theory, based on the notions of democracy and justice, discourse and intersubjectivity, modernistic regeneration by way of free inquiry, and on bridging the gap between metaphysics on the one hand and ethics and aesthetics on the other? In response to Gadamer, who wrote in his essay on the possibility for philosophical ethics, originally published in 1963, the crux of Aristotle's philosophical ethics lies in the mediation between logos and ethos, between the subjectivity of knowing and the substance of being. I'm not going to conclude this inquiry with the assumption the mediation attempted in these episodes is anywhere near bridging the elusive gap. I cannot even say for certain that a metaphysical refutation of physicalism can be taken as a component part of any reconciliation between what there is and what there should be. But I can say it's worth pursuing the inquiry further. Indeed, there continue to be many fascinating approaches dedicated to addressing these issues. For instance, Daniel Lasseter has written about a Bayesian semantics approach to non-consequentialist intuitions, and Matthew Chrisman has further investigated the meeting point between deontology and epistemology. However, these projects are beyond the scope of this inquiry. In my case, I'm going to follow the example of Schiller and set aside the metaphysical conjectures, at least for now, to focus on my art, not poetry or historiography, as was the case with Schiller, but perhaps a second opera. I have Niobe in mind. Nevertheless, if I'm unable to provide a definitive account of deontics, and with it some kind of a justification akin to that outlined by Kant for reasoning that I ought to help others, then what grounds are there for promoting values that emphasize care and empathy for others? Gadamer once more. Let us then orient ourselves on Aristotle, who has no concept of value, but rather virtues and goods, and who became the founder of philosophical ethics by correcting the intellectualism of Socrates and Plato without sacrificing its essential insight. The concept of ethos, with which he began, makes precisely this explicit. Virtue does not consist merely in knowledge, for the possibility of knowing depends, to the contrary, on what a person is like, and the being of each one is formed beforehand through his or her education and way of life. Perhaps Aristotle's view is focused more intensely on the conditionedness of our moral being, on the dependence of the individual decision on the practical and social determinants of the time, and less on the unconditionality that pertains to the ethic phenomenon. It's the middle of summer, and to finish, I've returned to the place where I started my inquiry, to the Theaterplatz, home to the Goethe and Schiller monument, home to German literature, and above all else, in the shadow of the Opera House, the German National Theatre, home to metaphysics. I picked up a copy of the summer programme for the Opera House. Well, actually, there's nothing on from the beginning of July until the end of August. Regrettably, it's closed for the summer. Not everything is well in the Weimar tradition. While a Weimarer Festspiele, less than an hour and a half from here, celebrates a great mythological tradition advanced by Liszt's chum, Wagner, here, unfortunately, there's nothing. Weimar has several summer festivals, as I've mentioned before, but without wanting to offend anybody, they're not akin to the ring cycle, something that might present the classical tradition of myth and, in turn, reveal the metaphysical considerations that have defined the entire Weimar tradition. Well, in my humble opinion, we need a summer festival to celebrate metaphysics. Not necessarily presented by New York City taxi drivers, although why not? but that primarily is an opera festival celebrating the metaphysics tradition outlined by Plato and in particular Aristotle, advanced by Euripides and Sophocles, and thereafter by a whole host of Weimar figures, from Luther to Goethe, Hegel to Nietzsche, and expressed by the aesthetics tradition stretching from Cranach to Schiller, from Bach to Strauss. A Weimarer Festspiele, an Iphigenia and Niobe festival? Why not? Thanks for watching and listening. I wish you all the very best.